So with no further ado, I want to start with an introduction to our guest today, Dr. Samuel Ramani, who is an expert on Russia and an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, ROSI. He is also the author of two books, one that was published last year about Russia in Africa, and the other one who's going to be published in April of this year, which is coming soon, and that is Putin's war on Ukraine, Russia's campaign for a global counter-revolution. So, Dr. Ramani, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, Oren.
The first question I'm going to ask is a very general one, and I think it's a way to kind of start the discussion with what we want to start from the perspective of how the war changed, not Ukraine, but Russia. And the question is, if you look at the two time periods of Russia 1 year from today and Russia today, what would you look at and say, this is what has changed, this was the change, and where do you see this is going in the upcoming future, the near future that we have?
So what I think was the most drastic change inside Russia was not necessarily something that occurred in the military or foreign policy situation, though obviously the Russians got a much more realistic assessment of the limitations of their military capabilities and of the inefficacy of the Serdyukov reforms that followed the Georgian War, and Russia had to recalibrate its foreign policy more towards the non-West than towards the West. But notwithstanding those changes in the security international spheres, the biggest change occurred domestically, internally, inside Russia. Effectively, we saw the locus of opposition to Vladimir Putin and the biggest threat to his leadership not come from the liberal opposition or the street protesters who went to the streets in 2012 at Bolotnaya Square, not the Alexei Navalny's, not the Vladimir Kara-Murzas and the like, but more coming from the elites, coming from the war hawks, coming from the people like Yevgeny Prigozhin, Kadyrov, people who are critical of the way the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Russian military is prosecuting this war effort. Not from those who want the war to end, but from those who want the war to be fought better. And that's quite interesting and quite extraordinary. So Vladimir Putin managed to suppress all remnants of the liberal opposition, create what appeared to be a totalitarian structure, only to have to cede, or at least give the illusion of ceding some of that totalitarian authority to these hawks on the right and to the nationalists. And the most striking example of this session and Russia's transition to some kind of a delegative or hybrid totalitarian regime were the civilian infrastructure strikes that were launched from late October. They served no military purpose. They were a waste of precision missiles, but they did satisfy that group, and that seems to be something that Russia has to follow. The other thing was conscription and mobilization, something Putin was very reluctant to do, but something that he ultimately had to do to appease that group. But Russian society has been remade and transformed effectively in terms of whether you're loyal or disloyal to this war. Passive support for this war is no longer enough. You need to be actively supportive of it. But we've also seen a massive transformation of the elite structure. So this has been quite fascinating, how Russian society is mobilized and united around a military intervention to a greater extent than any point since the Second World War, and also how Vladimir Putin created a totalitarian system by snuffing out liberal dissent, only to find that he's ceding some of his power potentially to threats coming from within the elites.
One of the elements that we've seen is that some people say the war is no longer serving Putin. Well, there is another school of thought that say the war is currently as it is being run, and there is a need by Putin for this war to continue in order to maintain his power. What would you say? Would you say that the war is currently serving Putin's needs to maintain his regime, acknowledging that the war did not go well to him and not according to his plans? Or we're at a point that the war is actually posing a threat to his regime, and we might lead to some sort of a coup or some sort of a counter movement against him in order to push him away?
I don't think that the war is necessarily posing a threat to his regime, because I've just said, the anti-war protesters and the people who are even disenfranchised or just upset with socioeconomic conditions and casualties are not going to be showing active opposition or coming to the streets or displaying their aversion to what's happening over here. If anything, you may not see that much enthusiasm for the war coming from people in the ages of 18 to 40. But in general, the mood when you look at opinion surveys is passivity and apathy. So what you see is enthusiastic support for the war amongst people who lived through the Soviet era. Even those who lived through and remember the Soviet war in Afghanistan somehow are not applying that filter and that experience to the current conflict. And then the people under 40, it's mostly indifference, passive opposition, and a smaller group of younger nationalists who actually are supporting this. So there really isn't a threat coming from below to him. Also amongst the elites, I mean, the war is a good way to keep elite dissent in check because he can easily label anybody who challenges him as a fifth column if he chooses, or use the discreditation of the military and the 15 years in prison and some of the other emergency measures that have been imposed to persecute and crack down on dissent, or he can allow the dissent and feuds between these different ministries to fester, where Putin looks like the only statesman, right? So when you see Evgeny Prigozhin attacking Shoigu's son-in-law, attacking the Ministry of Defense, attacking Gerasimov, the MOD kind of having a credit battle with the Wagner group, they all look like relatively like immature, squabbling amongst each other, and Putin still looks like the president on the top who's kind of holding the reins of power. So I think that some of this internecine squabbling actually suits Vladimir Putin, and the threat from below isn't there. And also, I believe that the war needs to be sustained right now for the foreseeable future for Putin to really maintain his power. Because if the war ends, there's going to be a focus on the fact that during his fourth term, he was elected in 2018 again with a focus on socioeconomic issues. The first major test to his regime were the pension reform protests. And he hasn't delivered on improving the economy or strengthening the position of the Russian middle class. And his other major legacy, which is Russian military might coming out of Syria, and also Russia's standing in the world, have been indefinitely eroded by the failures in Ukraine, and also by, no matter how much he spins as a hybrid total war from the West, growing isolation from the international community, and Russia's being seen as a discredited pariah state. So he has to kind of keep this war going and keep people distracted and keep people focused on this to prevent people from acknowledging that he's not only failed to deliver on his fourth-term promises, he's also undone most of the supposed achievements that he had created during his third term.
Looking at the war and looking at the potential ending of the war, do you think that the current Chinese-Ukraine peace plan that is being discussed, and we've seen a little bit here and there, some headlines in the news, do you think that has any chance of signaling kind of like a light at the end of the tunnel, or signaling some sort of a movement towards some process of a peace between Russia and Ukraine, or do you think that's basically just going to get stuck at the headlines phase?
So I think that China's position on this war has been obviously quite interesting. I mean, I think that the Chinese probably ideally would have wanted to have seen Russia win quickly, because that would have been a sign that Russia is a military counterweight, or at least a military adjacent counterweight to the West, and a Ukraine that was isolated and which had a proxy regime led by somebody like Viktor Medvedchuk or Oleg Saryov or somebody in that ilk, who which was isolated like Belarus, would have allowed China to swoop in, lead the reconstruction, seize the rare earth metals, seize a lot of the agricultural assets and other things that are within its territory. The Chinese also, now that goal has failed, they're not really that invested in Russia succeeding in the small granular scale. They don't really care what the balance of forces, I think, are in Donetsk or in Zaporizhia and Kherson. But the most important thing they don't want to see happen is to see Russia completely fail. Because if Russia completely fails, it will become more dependent on China, which may come with benefits. Though I think we've overestimated the degree to which China has been purchasing discounted oil. There was actually a recent study that came out today that showed Chinese oil purchases on average have been, not that different from the West in terms of pricing. So that's just one thing I want to draw attention to. But it would also become a warning shot to anybody who might want to attempt this kind of revisionist conflict in the future, and would strengthen the hand of America quite substantially. So this peace plan should be viewed as kind of nudging China towards trying to nudge Russia towards potential negotiations while it still can, and before it loses more territory and loses loses its bargaining position further. So I think it's more of a message to Russia, a signal to Russia that it is actually a sincere effort to promote peace, because it's really short on specifics, right? The only measure that the Ukrainians would be able to rally behind is China's support for state sovereignty. But that support for state sovereignty is meaningless if you're not actually condemning the violation of sovereignty to begin with, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the rest of it are all platitudes. So humanitarian corridors, Black Sea grain deal, those are things that have already been in action. And other things like an immediate ceasefire are exactly lifted from China's peace plans from other conflicts, like Libya, like Syria, like Yemen. They've announced very similar kinds of political solutions in the past without much teeth, and I suspect that it's going to be the same in this case. The only Western leader who seems to be actually taking the Chinese peace plan somewhat seriously, and perhaps unsurprisingly to those who have followed his maneuvers over the past few years, is Emmanuel Macron. right? But Germany certainly is not taking it very seriously with the new, more hawkish orientation of Pistorius alongside Baerbock, and the West in general is shunning it, and the collective non-West is predictably rallying around it because they see some kind of a generic both sides are at fault kind of solution as being neutral and being somehow pro-peace. That's why countries like Iran, countries like Kazakhstan, and others have endorsed it. And China is also using this both sides of the fault narrative to strengthen its narrative messaging in the global south that NATO expansion and bloc confrontations and bloc politics are a threat to international stability. And that's something that's quite popular in Africa, the Middle East, and in swathes of the Indo-Pacific region. And why it's doing that is to not only promote and amplify Russian narratives against the US, but also to build soft power and to build an international opinion about NATO's potential creation of an alliance of sorts or an encirclement of China in the Indo-Pacific region in its own sphere. So I think that this is largely symbolic, and for the reasons I've said.
Moving a little bit from the internal situation in Russia, the Chinese negotiation plans, to the battlefield itself, one of the greatest discussions that we've seen among our experts is, are we witnessing the spring Russian offensive taking place right now in failing, or are we going to see a Russian spring offensive taking place in the spring, hence the recruitment and the establishment of forces and so on? Where are you in this debate? Are we saying the offensive that was supposed to be, so to speak, in the spring already took place, did not succeed, or is that something that is a signal to come about what are we about to see?
So great question, but I would probably take a middle ground in this certain issue. And because I think that the Russians have learned one thing from the first year of the conflict, and that's you can't launch a multi-axis offensive with insufficient manpower. So when the Russians first started this war, right, they attacked Kiev, they attacked Donbass, they attacked Kharkiv, they attacked tried to landlock Ukraine on the Black Sea. They advanced from the Crimea axis, the Donbass axis, the Belarusian axis, all at once, with a military invasion border force of 150 to 170,000 troops. And they suffered heavy casualties, humiliating setbacks in Kiev and elsewhere. Sergei Surovikin may no longer be the dominant force within the Russian military. He's been demoted by Valery Gerasimov to number 2. But one thing that Surovikin did do was kind of change the military strategic culture inside Russia during his time as commander from October to January, and really place an emphasis on centralization of the command structure, as well as advocating for a single axis, or maybe at most 2 axes of advance at any given time. So that's why I think that the spring offensive coming from Russia will be largely revolving around what we're already seeing. So that's why I think the spring offensive has already begun. So the focus on Donetsk, the aggressive focus on converting the small victory in Soledar to a bigger victory in Bakhmut, and then much more illusory victories in Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, and also making sure that Russia does not do multiple axis offensives and drain its resources, but also deploys substantial amounts of resources towards defense. That was another thing that Surovikin started advocating, was the building of fortifications in the other bank of Kherson, in Melitopol and Zaporizhia, very crucial supply line, as well as Luhansk, where the Ukrainians are making gains. But there may be still a surprise in the hat about where the second axis of the spring offensive might emerge. So they may not do multiple 5 or 6 axes at once, and it's unlikely, the second axis is unlikely to be Kiev, but it might be somewhere like trying to take an offensive on Zaporizhia city, for example. So if the Ukrainians are focusing their counteroffensive on Crimea and Luhansk, on trying to detach Crimea from Russia with long-range strikes on places like Mariupol, like the Ukrainians have said, and on the other bank of Kherson, they may not be attacking Zaporizhia as much. So the Russians might try to launch an attack on Zaporizhia city. We've seen Yevgeny Belitsky, the Russian proxy administrator, suggest that could be possible at some point in April. Alternatively, if the Ukrainians strike on Melitopol, they might go and try to recapture Kherson. So there'll likely be a primary axis of the Russian offensive in the spring that's already begun focusing on Donetsk. There'll be a second axis as well, and that will be determined by the conditions on the ground, and that might become clear in April. So the offensive has largely begun, but the last 20 or 30% of it is probably still a work in progress and yet to be seen.
Moving from the Russian side to the Ukrainian side, how likely are we going to see them being able to push the envelope for their own counteroffensive without pushing the envelope of targeting those infrastructure targets within Russia and other targets that might be a bit too sensitive, poking the bar a little bit too much. How much can we see that, something like that? And are we likely to see a Ukrainian counteroffensive without doing that?
I think the most likely Ukrainian counteroffensive is going to be a hybrid counteroffensive, where obviously they're dealing with maneuvering the frontline situation on the ground in their favor, and also making short range and long range strikes into Russian occupied territory and into Russian territory itself. So the Ukrainian counteroffensive will probably advance on, I've debated some of the axes in which it could advance already, like, on Kherson, on Melitopol, on Luhansk. They may not be able to combine multiple axes of advance with the new Russian conscription and new additional Russian manpower, but they'll probably try to do at least two. Like in the spring and then in the summer, they did Kharkiv and Kherson at the same time. They might try to do two from those that I've just listed. And then they will also want to create the image inside Russia and create the insecurity and the vulnerability inside Russia that occupied territory is really occupied territory. These next regions are not yours. They really belong to us, and your stay here is temporary. That's good for morale inside Ukraine because it shows that they're deoccupying and it shows that they're resisting it. It also causes irrational decision making, and it rattles and it unsettles the Russian proxies who are sitting there. So just the very fear of a Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson is already allegedly causing 2 Russian administrators in Kherson villages to leave to Crimea over the course of the past 48 hours. And they'll launch random attacks, therefore, on Russian military assets in Melitopol as a precursor to advancing on the area, and also in places like Mariupol, in Makivka, like we see deeper into Donetsk, and in Crimea. So they will be launching attacks on those areas. There'll be fewer, but a select range of attacks that will occur across the border into Russian Federation proper. So we'll be seeing likely attacks on Belgorod. We saw Vadim Skibitsky actually single out Belgorod yesterday as an area where the Ukrainians are going to ramp up their attacks. And we've seen hawks in Russia, like Igor Shokov-Gurkin, even talk about a Belgorod front, euphemistically poking at the fact that the Russians aren't campaigning or defending their own territory properly. And a smaller number of longer range attacks, maybe like we've seen in Ryazan on the air bases, or on Russian military infrastructure in Belarus, like the partisan attack we saw allegedly take place earlier this week. And there just was something that broke over the past 2 hours. I don't know how many of you have seen it, a UAV targeting potential civilian infrastructure in Kolomna, 110 kilometers from Moscow. So we'll see largely a focus of Ukrainian attacks on the Russian occupied areas to make them feel like they're less in control of them, and sporadic selective attacks on Russian airfields and military infrastructure elsewhere to degrade Russia's military capacity, and also to divert some of Russia's air defenses and some of Russia's military equipment towards homeland security and away from the front lines.
Before we move into questions about the global security architecture in the impact the war has on it, specifically related to Russia, one of the questions we have received from the crowd was related to the Black Sea. And that was, what are the anticipated risks for the shipping industry in the Black Sea, looking at at least mid-2023, within the conflict and within what just discussed. So this will be the last tactical question, so to speak, before we move to the more geopolitical and political about Russia. So how do you see that? What are going to be the risks for the shipping industry in the Black Sea looking into this year ahead?
So a great question. I think obviously much depends on the future and the sustainability of the Black Sea grain export deal. It's obviously being placed on probation every 4 months. The question is, do the Russians keep renewing it as they have done? Because obviously the last time around, there was so much brinkmanship about the Black Sea grain export deal, which saw the Russians even temporarily suspend their involvement. And they cited a whole range of factors and a whole range of grievances. One was that Russian fertilizer was not really entering international markets adequately because of Western sanctions. Now, was Ukrainians allegedly, as they claimed with British support, were targeting Russian military infrastructure in the Black Sea that was being used to safeguard the grain deal. So the attacks on Crimea were a problem. And also, they were just pointing out that, the grain ships could be used as conduits for arms supplies. So all three of those narratives and those conspiracies that were used to justify the initial suspension of the Black Sea grain deal remain very present in the Russian state media, amongst Russian pro-war Telegram channels, especially those aligned with Prigozhin. And the more we see any kind of sanctions or any kind of SWIFT-related disruptions in agricultural produce or economic and commercial interactions writ large, the sanctions issue will be brought up. They'll also start bringing up the narrative that, the Ukrainians are only giving and reselling grain to rich countries, not to Africa, not to the poorer countries. And any Ukrainian strikes on Crimea, which will be part of the counteroffensive, like we just discussed, will bring the point of view that you see Ukraine and the West are actually threatening the grain deal, and we're trying to protect it. So I think that all the risk factors that led to the initial suspension are still there. Russia might pull another temporary suspension or brinkmanship that disrupts the flow of grain, that disrupts the flow of traffic, and people don't know that the deal is going to be renewed for sure. It slows down the supply of grain and the supply of shipping. That's an important thing. Another more passive tactic that Russia could use, short of a suspension, is a stalling tactic on inspections. So basically, ships load themselves up with grain and get stuck at the Turkish port because of the joint monitoring mechanism, and Russia takes a month to approve ships for inspection. I've already seen that kind of stalling tactic take root even since they've renewed the Black Sea grain export deal. So there's a risk of brinkmanship and a risk of these kind of arbitrary delayed inspections, really creating problems for the Black Sea grain deal's implementation. And then, of course, there is the issue of mines, right? The Western countries are starting one by one to start taking the issue of demining Ukraine seriously. I mean, Luhansk governor Sergei Haidai has very, very emphatically that it could take 10 or 15 years for landmines to be removed. And then other similar discussions of sea mines being removed have kind of been taken more literally by Western governments. We saw Canada, for example, give $7.5 million to the demining. But it caused the EU, the US, do something similar. Obviously, the Ukrainians are reticent about completely demining the Black Sea because they want to make sure that the Russians find it as hard as possible to launch an amphibious landing on Odessa. But the destruction of Moscow and the fact that the Russians are struggling in Donetsk and the occupied regions that they've already claimed, let alone moving towards Odessa, has probably eased those fears for now, that they'll probably go along with some kind of demining if they have Western pressure on it. So I don't think the demining issue is as big a one in the longer term. So obviously it needs to be resolved for the safety of ships. The biggest X factor is whether Russia's brinkmanship and inspections that are recklessly timed cause panic in the markets and disrupt and cause delays in grain shipments. The Ukrainian infrastructure minister, who I spoke to at a back channel at a conference several months back, was making those issues precisely the main ones for the grain deal. This was before the whole ruckus that we saw in October.
So we have a few questions from the audience. I'm going to get to them in a few minutes. I'm still going to read a few of the questions we received from the audience at home before this webinar. But one of the things that has been kind of a theme that emerged consistently in the question is the global security architecture when it comes to the impact the war have on Russia and Russia's role in it. You're the author of a book about Russia in Africa. You mentioned Russia in Syria, Russia in Libya. Obviously, the what we call the near broad for Russia, i.e. the Central Asia countries such as Kazakhstan, those countries are also boiling up. So what kind of a security architecture are we going to be looking at in a year, 2 years from now, looking at what's going on in Ukraine and how is that going to impact Russia's role within that security architecture?
That's a really, really good question. I mean, obviously, the Russians have framed this war as some kind of a revision of the post-Cold War security architecture that they believed enabled American unipolarity and all of its excesses, like the military interventions in Kosovo, Iraq, and Libya, as well as in general, the construction of a rules-based international order where the West makes the rules and the non-West is forced to accept them. So the Russians are viewing this war as a means of overturning the unipolar order, as a means of overturning American hegemony. And prominent Russian officials like Sergei Lavrov, Dmitry Medvedev have actually articulated this as one of the goals of the war. And they especially started articulating this after April. So after they lost in Kiev, they had to start scrambling to come up with other reasons why this war was still a long-term kind of success. And this is a hybrid war with NATO. And one of them was, we're launching this war to overturn and create a more just and fair world order. In practice, however, I think that there's going to be several geopolitical shifts that I think we should be noticing and watching and focusing on in the coming months. The first, obviously, is the unassailable consolidation of the transatlantic alliance between the United States and Europe, and with Europe finally gradually and incrementally taking more of a responsibility for its own defense, though obviously still heavily reliant on the American security umbrella, and the inclusion of Finland and Sweden into NATO, as well as the accessions or potential accessions of countries in the Western Balkans and the applications of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova to the European Union, however long that might take, will lead to a consolidation of that Western bloc, more so with Europe being a pole that's in some ways more dependent on the United States, but also in some ways more independent. So that's just an interesting geopolitical shift. Multipolarity, as the Russians have defined it, will probably be more of a symbol rather than a reality. It'll probably be the question right now that we're seeing is that Russia's influence in the Middle East, in Africa, in the Indo-Pacific region, in Latin America has not atrophied because countries have not sanctioned Russia, or even if they've condemned the Russian invasion, they haven't cut off business as usual relations with Russia. But that does not mean that those countries are going to be willing to invest in Russia in any large quantity or view Russia as a reliable partner in the security sphere anymore, or really whether Russia's initiatives like de-dollarization, an alternative to SWIFT, right, or any kind of challenges to the U.S. economic order, and whether security institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization will be more than just forums for people with like-minded views to share ideas and actually turn into more durable and stronger security blocs. If anything, we've seen two of Russia's flagship projects of the multipolar order, the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, be effectively neutralized because Kazakhstan, Armenia, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, treaty allies of Russia, are not even backing Russia's conduct in Ukraine. The only one that is Belarus, and bilateral consultations in Belarus have superseded anything in the CSTO. The SCO also has shown itself not to be very effective in promoting peace or promoting any kind of security solutions or alternatives in this conflict. And the Eurasian Economic Union has been derailed by secondary sanctions. So if anything, multipolarity, as Russia has advertised it and framed it, has become more of an illusion than a reality. It's more that countries in the non-West are not willing to join the West in condemning Russia rather than supporting the creation of a new world order. That's why I don't think the world order transformations will be that drastic from it, but it's more these kind of the reorientation of the U.S.-Europe relationship is arguably more important than I think the broader world order transitions.
Moving from world order, I'm going to take one of the questions here that was asked by the audience. And I'm reading here from the questions. How do you stop and deter Putin's nuclear Russian roulette? Meaning, we're looking back a few months ago. If you recall, I think everybody recalled, everybody thought that it's just a matter of days before Putin is going to go and show some exhibition of Russian test / use / something nuclear. And how likely are we going to see that happening again? How is that can be deterred / can be stopped, or at the very least can be put in a place that it's not going to be showing up again? So how do you deter the Putin's nuclear Russian roulette?
Well, nuclear blackmail has long been one of the most trusted tactics in Russia's arsenal to deter any kind of Western or NATO moves that it doesn't like to see happen. We just have to go back to 2008. When the Bucharest summit was being held and Georgia and Ukraine were about to join NATO, and the Bush administration was discussing about a missile shield and defense system in countries in East Central Europe. And we saw the Russians relay nuclear threats against Poland at a military level. So to try to prevent and try to disrupt these developments. So the Russians have used nuclear blackmail and nuclear threat in this war in exactly the same way. They hope that it would deter Western arms transfers to Ukraine, or at the very least, the transfers of heavy weaponry, like tanks, or down the line now, fighter jets, or ATACMS, or long-range missiles. The nuclear brinkmanship strategy has been effective, I think, in deterring some long-range missiles. But there's even a debate on that now. There's a debate in the West about whether to send jets, and the question is not really whether we're afraid of Russia using nukes, but we're more afraid of the fact that the Ukrainians may not just be able to train and get the jets in time. The jet stocks for NATO countries may not be enough, and tanks, it's a non-issue because the tanks have arrived in large numbers to the point at which we may have two fully functioning tank brigades in the Ukrainian army. So 1 year in, Russia's nuclear blackmail and nuclear brinkmanship, which is their time-tested tactic, has largely failed in its primary objective, which is to prevent the West from moving large inflows of weapons on the ground. Obviously, the Russians might flip and argue that it may have led to a prevention of a direct NATO-Russia conflict and NATO kind of getting involved with boots on the ground. But they invent their own conspiracies about NATO mercenaries on the ground too. So, I mean, they can't really even come with that public argument because of what they come with. So I think it's mostly about that, and that's largely failed. I think that the nuclear risk, the peak moment of danger, was probably on around August or September of last year. Because Putin had a clear choice, right? It was either the war was going disastrously, right? They had lost in Kharkiv, they were about to lose in Kherson. They didn't have the manpower to fight a conventional war. So he had two choices. One was conscription, or one was taking a nuclear gambit. I think he's opted towards conscription, mobilization, and towards going that route for as long as possible and fighting this war conventionally. Maybe because of pressure from China and from other friendly countries about what the consequences of this might be, and maybe because he views a long war with conscription and mobilization of society as the best way to withhold his regime. Either way, I think he's probably made a firmer decision not to use nuclear weapons. It doesn't mean that he won't be making these threats again, and the Russian officials won't be talking about the nuclear doctrine all the time. But I just think we've passed the moment of peak danger on the nuclear question right now. Obviously, things might change if the boundaries of the front lines move past February 24th borders and Crimea is at risk. Then we might be seeing a new moment of danger. But at this moment, I think the risk has receded.
One of the implications that we have seen this war had was on the relations between Russia and the Central Asian republics, i.e. the Kazakhstan and alike. One of the questions that are being asked by the audience, so how will that impact those countries' relations actually with the EU in terms of looking ahead? Do you think it will have an impact? Do you think if there will be an impact, what kind of an impact that we're going to see?
So with regards to Central Asia, it's been very interesting to see how Central Asia has responded to this war, because none of the Central Asian countries have actually endorsed Russia's invasion. We've seen Kazakhstan, for example, really be a major disappointment for the Russians, right? Because in January of 2022, the Russians, of course, authorized the most expansive use of CSTO force to protect Tokayev. And the protection of Tokayev was not really against protests of a scale that would have imminently threatened his regime. There was really no risk of an actual Euromaidan or an actual Orange Revolution happening inside Kazakhstan at that time. Most of these protests were based on socioeconomic grievances, rising prices. They've been dispersed across the country. The Russians really stepped in a drastic way to show loyalty to Tokayev against his perceived elite rivals from the Nazarbayev clan, and to show that they were willing to go all out and defend him. Probably with the caveat and with the expectation that when Russia went into Ukraine, Kazakhstan would back the Ukrainians, and the other Central Asian countries that trade with it would follow. I would move in that direction. When Kazakhstan talked about a peace settlement and withdrawal from all sides, they allowed pro-Ukrainian demonstrations to take place. They shipped oil to Germany. They became a refuge for anti-mobilization protesters. That was a massive, massive shock and disappointment to the Russians, and has led to some outrageous rhetoric coming from Russian commentators about denazifying Kazakhstan, about even nuking Kazakhstan. So it's been pretty much a major souring of that critical treaty alliance. And the other countries, it's been a very similar story. I mean, Uzbekistan and Russia were never treaty allies to begin with, but then they do cooperate still on issues relating to Afghan security. But the Uzbeks were really rankled by the Wagner group's efforts to overtly recruit foreign fighters from there. So that was a big problem for them. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, which are so dependent on Russian remittances, also are not going along with the war, which is a major disappointment for the Russians, because they've gone along with past Russian actions in Ukraine and Syria and other places. So we saw Tajikistan's president in particular, Samuel Ramani, talk about how we need to respect our allies. We want respect, right? That was a very famous video clip. And there's a portion of Tajik society that would, of course, be sympathetic towards Russia because they remember how Russia ended the Tajik civil war. They see Russia as some kind of a stabilizer. But public opinion in Central Asia is largely against this war. And it's because of the fact that it's disrupted inter-regional trade. It's created secondary sanctions barriers that are harming the middle classes and anybody with any purchasing power in those countries. And it's also seen as a potential forewarning that your sovereignty is always at risk. If Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine, they might do the same thing to us. So it's been really bad for Russian soft power in the post-Soviet space. The EU can invest, obviously, in these countries and try to pry them away from Russia. But the best thing to do at this moment is to let Russia shoot itself in the foot and let Russia's image deteriorate further, and then make engagement with these countries. Because we don't want to be, as much as we want to contain Russia, we also don't want to be propping up kleptocrats like Rahman for the foreseeable future and giving them too much more ammunition economically. So we should be careful in how we approach these regions, because Russia is his own worst enemy right now.
Before I have one more question, which is about the internal affairs slash the domestic politics within Russia. I'll get to that when we'll get to that theme again. We're moving between themes here very fast, which is brilliant, but I know it might be a little bit disorganized. So I want to kind of stay on the same lane for a little bit. One of the questions we have here is actually from the US perspective and in support of Ukraine. And the question goes, how long will the West, especially the US, be prepared to bankroll Ukraine? What kind of settlement serves Western interests?
So that's a great question about the United States and support for Ukraine. I think that the overwhelming majority of American public opinion is aligned towards supporting Ukraine for really as long as necessary at this point. I mean, and this same thing that's true for most European countries, aside from perhaps Hungary, and sometimes we look at opinions and surveys in Greece, you might see something contradictory. But in general, inflation, rising prices, rising food prices, rising energy prices have not had the impact that Russia assumed that they would on Western resolve, Western public resolve to support continuing this war. That's why I'm very skeptical of the arguments that, if there is a Republican White House victory in 2024 and there's some elements within the Republican Party, like the Matt Gaetzes and the Marjorie Taylor Greens and the Paul Gosars, who are making rumblings about Ukraine and U.S. support for it. Whether those rumblings will actually lead to a drastic change in American policy, I think much less likely than the media is hyping it up to be because of the level of popular support and genuine bipartisan support there. So that I think is something that's quite important and interesting to keep in mind and to consider. And so I think resolve is likely to remain for the foreseeable future. Within the Biden administration, I'm seeing three different perspectives kind of come forward. On the one hand, you see Sullivan and Milley more vocally really be more open to at least to the idea of negotiations and dialogue. We're seeing people like Victoria Nuland on the other side of the spectrum really taking on, unsurprisingly, a much more hawkish point of view. Even her being the architect of the sanctioning of Chinese companies that invaded Russia being the latest example. And then Anthony Blinken dancing between these two different points of view, talking about supporting Ukraine firmly to liberate it from all February 24th borders, but backing Ukraine if Ukraine wants to liberate Crimea. Of course, Ukraine wants to liberate Crimea. Zelensky's been talking about that, and Ukrainians have been talking about that for 9 years now. So it's kind of a bit of a cop out there and a bit of a balance between those two different factions. So I think that there will be genuine disagreements and debates largely behind the scenes in the Biden administration that will play out over the course of the next year. But the forces that are continuing to support arms to Ukraine will likely predominate. I think the key decision, which was like on the Abrams tanks deliveries, even if they won't come immediately, that encouraged other NATO allies to supply Leopards and other tanks to Ukraine. The Americans might make a similar kind of determination on fighter jets in the near future that encourages other countries to deliver them. So I think that we're going to be more likely to see landmark American decisions that encourage allies to escalate and increase the transfer of arms rather than American pressure on the allies to rein them in, and Americans slapping the French and the Germans on the wrist if they ever go back to their kind of let's have a ceasefire impulses.
You spoke about Crimea. Before I go again into the internal politics, I want to keep it on this lane of questioning. In many of our simulations, the scenario of Ukraine liberating Crimea was kind of the grand finale for basically this is the end of the Russian war. This will be basically the blow that will basically will force Russia to admit this is a defeat. One, do you agree with that? It's a scenario that has emerged several times during our simulations. And two, would Russia respond to that in a way that could be unconventional, let's say?
Well, I think it would, for all intents and purposes, be the end of the war in Ukraine. And it would be such a drastic loss to Putin's legacy. Because, in public opinion surveys, before they really got completely co-opted by the state, we started seeing the Crimea annexation being viewed, along with the military modernization, as the two top achievements of Russia from 2010 to 2020. Obviously, the military modernization has failed drastically with the war in Ukraine, and the loss of Crimea would be a complete dismantling of Putin's legacy of the second half of his presidency. So it's obviously something that he wants to avoid at all costs. And the Ukrainians obviously are talking about, extending the war beyond and talking about the dismemberment of Russia or the denuclearization of Russia. We see people like Alexei Danilov coming up with that. I mean, that is nationalist jingoism for the home audience and to kind of keep people wanting to punish and get back at Russia. And similar with taking Russia off the UN Security Council. There's a genuine legal debate about whether Russia is a Soviet successor state and what its role should be as arguably the world's biggest violator of sovereignty right now, participating in an institution that's aimed at guarding the sovereignty of states. But those are all more conceptual issues. The end of the war will be the liberation of Crimea if that does happen. So I agree with that assessment. And Crimea is surprisingly vulnerable. We've already seen it being vulnerable to long-range Ukrainian strikes repeatedly, from the Kerch Bridge to the Saki Air Base. We've seen the Russians move some of the Black Sea fleet over to Sikh because they were afraid about stationing it too close to Crimea because of the fear of the Moscow attack. We're seeing fortifications being built on or around the area, and even hardliners in Russia, like Russian MP Andrei Gorulyev, say that he's the guy who wants to nuke NATO forces in Poland and nuke Britain. So this is one of the most hawkish members you can imagine. And he's saying, Crimea was relatively unsafe for a period, but we've taken measures to save it, and now it's fine. So the Russians are definitely thinking about this scenario, and Crimea is vulnerable to a Ukrainian counterattack. And there is a risk, obviously, that the Russians, if Putin felt that there were agitations and pressure coming from the hawks at home, from the Prigozhin and the likes, or nationalists that could be at imminent risk of a coup, I think he could take a gamble at using a nuclear, non-conventional response. Maybe a tactical nuclear strike, not in a major population center or city, but a strategically important area of terrain that forces the Ukrainians to demilitarize and pull back. So we've seen simulations about whether he'll do a tactical nuke on a place like Snake Island, or a tactical nuke on a place like on the front, near the front lines, but not where the population clusters are. I think that there is a small but not insignificant risk of that happening if the Crimea situation is under threat. But more likely, I think, given the consequences that would likely be leading to Russia being almost isolated from the world economy and other things like this that could come with it, maybe Putin may not even take that step.
One of the experts I spoke to recently said that one of the greatest accomplishments Putin may knowledgeably or not knowledgeably achieve was the establishment and the rise of the Wagner group, and primarily that being as part of the competitor to the Russian military and army. One of the questions we received from the audience related to that is if you can comment on the relationship between Putin and Evgeny Prigozhin, and I hope I say his name correctly, probably I'm not, Prigozhin, I butchered that name. And if you can talk a little bit about their relationship and about how is that relationship evolving, acknowledging that the Wagner Group currently is not succeeding in the mission and task that was given to them by Putin.
Well, Prigozhin's rise to power and rise to influence is really an extraordinary story, right? This is a man who started his career in organized crime in 1978, 1979, along with his colleague Alexei Bushman. He was involved in armed robberies. He spent 11 years in prison. Then he became a hot dog vendor, and now he's one of the most powerful people inside Russia. So it's a remarkable story. It's a story that is based on personal patronage, right? Unlike other oligarchs, right, who have who without the Kremlin's largesse would have control over substantial sectors of the Russian economy, or benefited from privatization. Prigozhin's wealth, Prigozhin's power, Prigozhin's influence is inextricably linked to his personal relationship with Vladimir Putin. Whether they're friends or not is a debatable thing. We do know that they did cross paths in St. Petersburg in the late 1990s when Putin was a frequent guest at New Island restaurant, and Prigozhin was its restaurateur and head chef, and the Concord Catering Company owned it. Putin himself has denied having any kind of a personal friendship with Prigozhin. He was asked about it, I think, in an interview around the time of the Mueller investigation. And he says, he's one of many people that I know inside Russia. I have meetings with lots of people. So he doesn't really draw too much attention to it. But it's clear that they do have a longstanding personal relationship. And Putin trusts Prigozhin as somebody who can do deniable interventions on his behalf and deniable activities on his behalf, and also circumvent institutions. So he doesn't really necessarily trust the Russian Ministry of Defense, Shoigu Gerasimov, so much. We've seen it by him speaking to local and lower level generals, lower level commanders on the front lines, and getting their own perspective himself as the war has progressed. And also he wants to outsource some of the security responsibilities to figures loyal to him like Prigozhin, so the Silovik he would never unite against him. So Prigozhin serves a purpose for him as being an alternative to the existing institutions. Yeah, but they do have a long-standing relationship regardless of where it serves. I think that he will be kept in the firmament for that reason and for some time. But Prigozhin has made some major tactical mistakes, I think, that are going to potentially limit and blunt the long-term growth of his influence. First, I think, was going public so brazenly against so many people at once, attacking the Shoigu's son-in-law, attacking Shoigu as a tyrant, attacking Gerasimov, attacking regional governors all over the place, like St. Petersburg Governor Alexander Beglov and others. Putin has not gone to dismiss or gone to marginalize any of the people that Prigozhin has been moving to criticize, even if Prigozhin is pushing for that. If anything, Prigozhin's favorite general, Sergei Surovikin, has been demoted for Gerasimov, which is a real slap in the face for him. So he's made a lot of enemies that will kind of isolate his ability to build an elite coalition or an alternative power vertical inside Russia. And now he's presided very publicly over failures, right? He did manage to achieve a victory in Solidar, but in Bakhmut, all we're seeing is loss of prison recruitment, loss of casualties, the heavy casualties, and a failure to take over the city after many, many months, and arguments and excuses that are wholly unconvincing. Like he wanted to create a meat grinder that will kill more Ukrainians and Russians. Or Leopard tanks have shown up on the front lines when they just arrived 4 days ago. They're nowhere near, right? He's coming up with conspiracies and excuses that nobody believes. So I think that Prigozhin's influence has grown because of this war, but he's overplayed his hand in recent months that he now is probably going to be less of a threat to Putin, or really less of a very powerful and decisive independent actor. When I used to speak to Russian defense experts in the summer, they were saying, we were dissatisfied with the Russian military except for Wagner. Wagner is the most effective fighting force. Now Wagner has the same command structure problems, the same low morale, the same problems of poor training and poor logistics that the rest of the branches are. I don't think anyone would say that about Wagner now. So he's kind of basically eviscerated the myth of Wagner. But Wagner does play an important role for Russia's global power projection, especially in Africa, and also for getting access to oil and minerals that can circumvent Western sanctions and also finance this war. So Wagner's activities in Africa have been somewhat more successful, but his public grandstanding against the Russian elites and his actions in Ukraine most recently are probably hurting Prigozhin's stature rather than helping him.
One of the interesting insights that we had in the simulations, one of the simulations we played a few months ago, was about this is no longer Putin's war, but this is a Russian leadership war, meaning that even if Putin is /replaced, assassinated, or die naturally for natural causes, whoever is going to come afterwards is not likely to end the war for Russia. One, do you agree with that assessment? And two, do you see anything that change or might change in the Russian leadership, the Russian leadership, in case something happens with Putin?
I think absolutely. I think that this is the systemic problem that we're facing inside Russia. This kind of expansionism and this aggressive foreign policy. It's not just the product of a single person like Vladimir Putin. So I would agree that leadership changes without a full-fledged regime or systemic change will not really lead to a drastic change in policy, because the successor is most likely to keep or maintain or have ties to the existing orbit. If it's somebody like Patrushev, if it's somebody like Dmitry Medvedev, there's going to be no change in this current war effort. If anything, there may be a greater risk of more irrational and tactics like the use of nuclear weapons, given these people's current ideologies and current volatility that we're seeing coming from them. So if anything, there's a risk that the successor could even create an even more dangerous situation than what we have right now. And that's quite a concerning prospect. So I think, it is going to be largely continued regardless of who's in power, unless there's a systemic change in Russia. Keep in mind, the Soviet war in Afghanistan, right, was presided over by 4 general secretaries before Gorbachev brought it to an end. And that will likely be the same thing that would happen in the case of a leadership change in Ukraine, over the Ukraine, in Putin for Ukraine. Yeah.
As we're short on time, I'm going to ask one more question that I see here from the audience. There's a few more questions that we received from home that I want to ask about China and Russia. So let's take it to what we call the international thing, i.e. Russia and Latin America, Russia and China. So we'll start with Russia and Latin America. The question from the audience is this: what about Russia links to presence in Venezuela and Cuba? Any risk in the road to threat U.S.?
Sergei Rybakov, right, the deputy foreign minister, made an alarming statement about this when the Russians were not getting what they wanted on NATO security guarantees and about no more expansion of the alliance and rolling back NATO's presence to out of everywhere from Bulgaria and Romania and afterwards. And when they said that they would be able to potentially put bases or troops in Cuba and Venezuela. And that really caused some alarm in the United States, but no senior Russian official has actually echoed or repeated that threat since the war began. And the only people who are really advocating for this are real hardliners like Alexander Dugin, who have talked about this. So, but more people in the media and philosopher sphere rather than in the security policy sphere. So I don't really think that the Russians are going to make any kind of military or military hardware movement towards Cuba and Venezuela to rattle or threaten the United States. If they're going to move military hardware and assets somewhere, they're going to move it to Africa. We're already seeing them increase their presence of helicopters in Mali. Mali's got potential gold reserves that could fund this war. They might go into Burkina Faso and get their gold mines to fund this war. They're going to put their resources, which are limited, in areas which could give them financial inflows to finance the war. And going to Cuba and Venezuela is probably not really going to be the best path to be able to do that. So I don't think there's going to be any kind of a movement there, even if both countries are obviously relatively loyal in support for the Russian invasion. It's interesting, though, that Cuba tends to abstain on resolutions relating to Russia rather than support them, which maybe is a sign of just how isolated Russia is at the moment.
We spoke a little bit about the Chinese peace proposal. You talked and explained about that. But one of the main insights that we are repeatedly receiving through the simulations is if there's anyone who's gaining anything from this situation in Ukraine and the war in Ukraine between Russia, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is China. That they have indeed increased not only their presence when it comes to their dominance over the relations with Russia, but also potentially in the future enjoy tremendously from the weakening of Russia. Where do you see these relations going between Russia and China? Where do you see the Chinese basically benefiting, and in what way maybe they're not going to be benefiting from the weakening Russian status as the aftermath of the conflict in Ukraine?
So, yeah, as I said at the earlier point, I mean, China's probably preferred scenario would have been a Russian victory. And now that has not really been achieved in the sense that Putin envisioned last February 24th. It's now about avoiding Russian collapse. And it's about making sure that Russia is dependent on China economically, but isn't a burden or some kind of an unstable liability on its borders. That's why when I'm talking about that would just to recap what I said. And with regards to how the future of Russia-China relations are going to go, I think that the ideologically, when you look at the views of Chinese state media, Chinese intellectuals, Chinese officials, they're starting to view a lot of international situations quite similarly, whether it be the NATO expansion, whether it be American unilateralism, unilateral sanctions. They have a lot more normative and ideological groundings of this partnership. But that normative and ideological talk and symbolic displays of solidarity, like an expansion of the array of joint military drills everywhere from Eurasia to the Indian Ocean, is not really translating into the kind of cooperation that Russia really wants or needs. For example, when Russia was short on aviation parts, they went to Turkey and India. China was very late to come in and didn't even give them the capacity that they wanted. Chinese state-owned companies are pausing some investments even in Russian energy because they're concerned about secondary sanctions. We're seeing the Huawei have some issues with the relocation of their offices to Kazakhstan. We're seeing also now the debate about Chinese lethal and non-lethal military aid. I'm very skeptical of China supplying lethal military aid on the scale that Iran has done with regards to drones and missiles. I think they could supply uniforms, they could supply extra food, they could supply, things that help the war effort indirectly, but not really moving towards arms because they don't want to be seen as a party to this conflict. And China is seeing its arms manufacturers as having an opportunity to compensate and capitalize on potential sanctions against Russian arms globally. Those Rosa-born export cannot export as much because of supply constraints and the use for the war and sanctions. The Chinese want to step in. So that's why I don't think there's going to be a radical overhaul of the relationship where these ideological and ideational synergies get converted into China and Russia really becoming full-fledged allies. China's going to do the minimum to prevent Russia avoid collapse, but not enough to really invest and prop up the Russian economy on its own or really supply game-changing military assistance for the war effort.
We are really at the end of the webinar, so I would say that the last question, it would be more of a comment from you to the audience. How would you summarize the main insights that you have? What would you like to conclude with? What would you like to people take away from this webinar, from the analysis that you have? What would be your conclusion? Let's put it this way.
Well, yeah, just an overall point of view is that it's interesting to see that the Russian military obviously failed to meet the expectations that were set to it, but also Russia's place in the world is now coming under increased question. Is it going to be able to remain a great power? Is it going to be reduced to the status of a regional power, or is it going to be something in between? In my book, Russia and Africa, and also to a lesser extent, my book, Putin's War in Ukraine, I present the argument that Russia's future is that of a virtual great power. So it has the UN Security Council veto seat. It has the nuclear arsenal that's the largest in the world. It participates in institutions like the SCO or BRICS or through bilateral engagements with smaller countries, looking like an alternative pole in the world order. But in practice, it lacks the economic capability and the military might and now the ability to really invest or the soft power to be able to actually exert anything near what it promises. So it's all an image, it's all a facade. That was true even before the war, and now it's even more true now. So I think that Russia's future place in the world is probably being that of a virtual great power. And obviously, another thing that I want to kind of take away with and want to monitor very closely is how the domestic debates in Russia evolve once if the Ukrainians do manage to achieve a successful spring to autumn counteroffensive and the boundaries of Russia's occupation are pushed past February 24th lines. Like, what will be the nature of the elite debates over inside Russia? Will there be more of a general mobilization of society and creation of a war economy, like an all-out draft that's officially announced, a war economy that basically redirects much more production towards ammunition and towards domestic munitions production away from other sectors? Putin has faced pressure to make those moves. He's shied away from them so far. That could be one of the big questions because it's got such profound implications for Russia's internal future going forward.
Dr. Samuel Ramani, thank you so much for joining us today, answering the questions from me, the audience, the people at home. This and the feedback I'm getting from everybody, this has been a brilliant webinar with a lot of good answers and a lot of insightful insights for a lot of people here. So thank you so much for joining us on this.
Well, thank you so much, Oren. It was great to be here.